Welcome, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS, and I have a great opportunity today to talk to an old friend about a book he's just written. He's written books before, but this is really a fresh and interesting book. Dr. John Deutch is a university professor at MIT. I first got to know him when he was the Undersecretary for Acquisition Technology at the Defense Department. He then became my boss as the Deputy Secretary. He then went to the CIA, and then he is back at MIT, where he has been working in and around energy his whole life. And this is an interesting book. The book is entitled 50 Years of Energy Policy, 1973 to 2003. It's an interesting book because it's really two books. The first 10 chapters are history, and you take us through the major developments, over the last 50 years, especially presidents, how they were dealing with it, organized it around presidencies, but highlighted, important either political developments or technical developments, international developments, like the crisis after the Yom Kippur War, or technology developments, and then weave it together to create an interesting narrative about how America dealt with that from a policy standpoint. But he uses that as a book for the second half, which is to how do we understand the problems of today? And it's primarily a story about, is it possible for America to get an energy transition policy that deals with climate change? So, John, welcome. We are excited to have you here. Do you want to say anything at the outset, just in framing? And then I have a bunch of questions to ask you.
Well, first of all, I want to say something about John Hamre. We did meet at the beginning of the first Clinton administration, when I came there to be, as you said, Undersecretary for Acquisition. The secretary was Les Aspin, who had been chairman of the House
Armed Services.
And the place was full of people from the House. For example, Rudy DeLeon, who is here today, who was the staff director for Les, both at the House. There was nobody from the Senate, except for Hamre. He had a very hard time. And people were always doubtful. They were snickering about him. But I didn't know him very well, but he did a terrific job there. He gathered probably the best team that there was at that time, with Bill Lind and Alice Maroney. It was a fantastic team. So he really did become integrated. To my surprise, he was one of us, one of them. And then, of course, he did marvelously. He went on to be deputy secretary and so on. And then he's come here. I think of CSIS as sort of a shack on K Street. And he's made it into a, kind of an international deal. So I'm very, very pleased and honored that you're willing to talk with me about this book. So thank you.
Well, I'm delighted that you're here.
And let me, you want to say one thing. This book is what is called applied history. Mm-hmm. Applied history is really the key here. Use what you've learned about how the past happened to help you deal with what you're going to encounter in the future. And that is very, very relevant today because we have a big climate challenge. And how are we going to deal with that? And what does the past tell us about it?
Well, you point that out in your preface, that you are drawing on the discipline that Ernie May and Richard Neustadt put together in Thinking in Time, that book. And so you use those first 10 chapters to bring us back into that history, make it fresh, and then bring us to look at today's problems. But it's a real problem for a moderator to say, how do you approach this book? Do I approach it from the first 10 chapters, or do I do it from chapter 11, 12, 13? So I'm going to the second. I'm going to start with the problems of today, and then I'll ask you probably to go back and refer to things earlier in the book. In chapter 11, which is Climate Change Challenge Going Forward, you start by outlining 7 domestic issues that have to be resolved. And I think it's a useful thing to use that as a framing structure for this conversation. So the first domestic issue is a pricing mechanism for greenhouse gases. And then you say, very importantly, it has to be linked to carbon border adjustment mechanism. Do you want to just expand on that for us?
Well, you do know that the issue about the balance sheet of a country does depend about what its imports and exports do. So, for example, I think I also mentioned in the book, President Obama was very, very keen on having coal plants reduce their emissions, but was also very keen on exporting coal. Now, if you think about climate as a global problem, it's really the net that you have to be focusing about. So it seems to me that the border adjustment issue, now, if you talk to a really technical person who knows about how you do border adjustments with taxes or payments, it is awfully difficult to do that with real objects because they are always so much a mixture of different components which have been made in different places under different circumstances. So actually administering that one, designing it and then administering it, is somewhat of a very large hope. Now, Europe is going to do this by making big buckets of stuff, and that gets you started there, but it doesn't mean that it's quite accurate. But surely you have to have border adjustments in there.
But it's very interesting. I mean, first of all, we're struggling in this country to come to a consensus on, is climate change something we're really going to do something about? The Biden administration is doing it, but it's really on a partisan basis. It doesn't have broad partisan support in Republican side. We may get a Republican president back here. How do we do carbon pricing or pricing of greenhouse gases in a way that would have a consensus here?
Well, one of the first lessons in the second half of the book, which is what you're focusing on, is if you don't have policy stability for a period of, I'm sorry to say this, decades, you're not going to make any progress on climate. And if you look at the past, we haven't had such periods of policy. And that's not a partisan question. It's, will the next administration have the same degree of principles to guide their climate actions, their climate hopes? And I think that's a very, very open, not for me, it's not an open question. I don't think it's possible. And that goes to the point of why would a leader say we should do this by setting a precise number at a precise period of time, 30 years or 50 years in the future, and say we will be at net zero emissions? It is not a credible statement, it seems to me, if you look at the past for sure, and if you look at the problems of administering it in a changing political policy world. So I mean, I will predict here, and I hope I will be held to it, that before 20 years are up, the idea of having net zero point goals will have been replaced by some other.
You mentioned that. The second thing you point out is needing to have kind of a 5-year reassessment process, or something where it's not a point estimate and then we all fail.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah.
John, if I could ask though, I think I understand, border adjustment procedures as it relates to sophisticated economies. But if I look at the International Energy Agency, I look at the forecasts, over the next 30 years, all of the, fossil fuel reductions that the rich countries are going to make are going to be completely offset by the increased use of fossil fuels by poor countries, primarily Africa, because of its huge expansion. How do we deal with that?
Well, first of all, that goes to the heart of, do we want in the United States our climate discussion, our climate policies, to have global attention or just national attention? It's not a big deal if we only want to do it for the United States. But if you say we have to really think about this in global terms, it is essential for the United States to interact, to really deal with those issues. And we have not proven not to do it. Pat and I, when we came down here on the plane today, we happened to be with Senator from, who was it we were with? Kerry? Kerry says, well, we're making great progress internationally. Is that what your view is? Is that no, not mine either. So the projections for India are just extraordinary. And they want to do it because their people want to be more prosperous, healthier.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, if you talk to, ambassadors from Africa, for example, they say, well, why are you telling me I can't do what you guys did? I'm not trying to pollute the world, but I'm trying to get my people richer. And there's this feeling that energy security is directly in tension with energy transition. How do you talk about that when you talk with people?
Well, I'm always going after it, trying to find myself in their shoes, mm-hmm. and thinking about how I could offer a way to make a win-win situation, mm-hmm. if that's possible. I'll give you an example. President Biden has said he wants for a moment to have a pause on the exports of LNG, liquefied natural gas, for new recipients who are not mm-hmm. Most favored nation status, or who don't have approved facility. And you could say, well, why don't we give LNG, encourage U.S. LNG to be exported to, let's say, India. If the Indians agree that they will substitute it for coal that they're planning to add to their power system. Mm-hmm. So that the net of the transfer would actually reduce global emissions. So there are places where you can do, by designing something, make some progress on this. I'd look for those things, not just say, we're not going to export mm-hmm. LNG. Mm-hmm. That doesn't help the Indians at all.
No, they've got a lot of focus on renewable energy, but 60% of their people are living in the countryside.
Well, they're going to commit themselves to 500 gigawatts of new photovoltaics, which is more than certainly the United States has or will have, mm-hmm. and they're going to do it. But that's just like a low 30%, I believe, of their energy budget. Their energy budget is made up by coal, imported oil, and imported gas. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about climate, we tend to put those things behind us.
John, the fourth item that you had in your list of key things was, I quote, realign responsibilities between the federal and state governments and between Congress and the executive branch. Ooh. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, look, I thought it was very sad the way you were treated when you came to the Department of Defense. But I guess I really, we have a committee structure, which when was the last time it changed in any?
1947.
Excuse me?
1947.
That's number one. And we still have to go up there every year for an annual authorization and appropriation cycle. And a lot of that, we know how that sausage is made. But you're not going to, if you're realistic about what needs to be done in terms of the size of the resources, the amount of attention that has to be done on project management, managing a huge project, transmission. Mm-hmm. Tell me what we're going to do about electricity transmission. I mean, have we really decided that the national government is going to be responsible for transmission at a time when we're expecting electricity generation to substitute for a lot of gas? So if you say, well, John, that's off the table, we can't do that. And I say, well, you've got to talk to me then differently about mm-hmm. what our aspirations are mm-hmm. for climate.
Well, let me pick up exactly on that. For other reasons, I looked at the 2023-33 NERC report, long-range forecast on the National Energy Reliability Council's assessment on where we are with the grids. And, in the mid-continent grid, there are 6 grids, there's the mid-continent grid. They're going to go below the reference margin for electricity reliability in 2027, in 3 years. I mean, so that's partly a generation problem, that's partly a grid licensing problem.
Getting permitting and licensing.
Permitting, it's getting a permit now. There might be some
I would even suggest to you that it may be something a little bit even more profound than that, and that is the grid is managed now as an approximation to what Maxwell's equations tells you is how electricity, current, and voltage move. That means that there will be occasions when you come perilously close to going and getting a real blackout. Mm-hmm. And the bigger the grid is, the more complex it is, the more that. So you have to go back and say, is the grid being, I don't mean in terms of the integrity of the people, I mean in terms of the actual mechanics of managing the grid. I think that that's going to be relooked, and that the technology is presently there to really do much better on modeling, digital modeling of the grid in almost real time. So you have the issue about where are the grid generation and distribution, transmission going to be done? And if you say to me, well, we're going to have to keep on negotiating it between the states and the feds, that doesn't sound to me like it's going to be very.
You know, but you highlight that the Biden administration said we're going to be 100%, zero carbon in electricity in 2035.
Yes, sir.
I look at the NERC report, and in 2033, natural gas grows, and it'll be over half of our generation. I mean, there's a disconnect here.
Yes, sir. It's your town. It's not my town. I mean, it is a horrible disconnect, and we do also have a tendency to lecture to other countries, especially to poor countries. We have a very strong missionary impulse in this country. To tell other people, as Mark Twain once said, that he pitied the poor Hawaiian savages that went to their death never knowing there was a hell. And we're pretty good at telling people about all of that, but we don't do too much about it ourselves. But it just seems to me that if I look at the International Energy Agency report, I mean, they highlight the, current policy, stated goals, and then what does it take to be zero carbon in 2050? We're way off the mark here. I know exactly what you mean. These three scenarios that they lean on, so that they can jump from one to the other, depending on who they're talking to and what concern. They don't. Those three scenarios permit them to avoid really saying what is going to happen in any particular region or in any particular sort of energy area, steel or cement or. So I'm not so keen. Scenarios are good some of the time, but if you exclusively rely on them, it stops you from really saying, what do I have to do to get this big piece of work done?
Well, that's really the issue. What do we have to do? And when I look at some of the things you've outlined in your book, I agree with them all. I mean, we should restructure how Congress oversees it. We should restructure, the federalism issue. How do we manage state regulation, federal government regulation? But I don't see how we're going to do any of that.
Well,
I know this is our problem. We're Washington.
Yeah, but it's not my professional area. It's yours. But let me just say to you, you'd hope that there were some people in Congress who would mention this from time to time, on either side of the aisle.
Well, it does look like we're still in the world of beliefs in the Congress rather than action. We believe things to be true.
Or we have aspirations.
Or aspirations.
We're not looking at it realistic.
By
the way, it's interesting. What about Europe? Is Europe doing a better job than we are? There's one thing which really strikes me. Excuse me, why are you laughing?
Well, I mean, Germany, which is so prideful of being on the green track, burned more lignite coal than any time in their human history.
How are they doing on nuclear? No,
we know how they're doing.
Germany's a perfect example, but there is something interesting about the European Union, as complex and bureaucratic as it is, and that is that they are people who use sticks more than we. We are people who use carrots. So the American way is give a subsidy or give a tax credit, a tax break. The Europeans are more set a regulation and have it go down sequentially. That's what they try to do. Now, they have lots of troubles getting that done, but it is a quite different approach.
But when I talk to European ambassadors here this spring, they say all the elections in Europe this year are going to be about two things. It's going to be about immigration, and it's going to be about pushback on climate change.
Pushback.
Pushback on climate change.
Well, I'm glad to hear they're not going to be talking about the Ukraine.
Yeah, that's our problem. It doesn't seem to be their problem.
We can pay for it.
Yeah. Well, let me ask about Ukraine. It kind of made it pretty vivid that energy security is still pretty important even in developed countries.
Yeah, when I talk about this myself, I always end up with this triangle, which has three vertices on it, which are tightly coupled. One of them is security. One of them, I hate to say this, is economics. And the other one is technology and innovation. They're all linked together, and if you try to do one piece without the other, you get yourself.
Can you're at MIT. I mean, it's the mother church of both Christian scientists as well as innovation. You guys are really, what's coming on the horizon on energy? What's going to transform the world? I mean, fusion's always in the future, but what do you think is going to happen?
Well, a part of the story of the book is technology surprises, things that you thought would happen which didn't happen. But also there have been some unexpected, enormously important technology advances, of which, one of them, which is extraordinarily, has made the United States the biggest oil producer in the world, the biggest natural gas exporter in the world, has been hydraulic fracturing. That's a real unexpected technology, and not, by the way, pushed by the government. It didn't come out of MIT. But that was, well, the other thing is nobody expected the price of photovoltaics to fall as precipitously and as deeply as. Now, it's unfortunate that most of those arrays are made by quite capable Chinese rather than by Americans. But the fact is that we now have photovoltaics as being very competitive for a renewable energy source, which is unfortunately a little bit intermittent. So what to do about covering the moments when you don't have coverage, the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't. By the way, with respect to wind, we're falling way behind what our expectations and our hopes were for offshore wind, again because of permitting and licensing.
How about batteries, battery technology? Do you see big breakthroughs coming yet, or what's happening in batteries?
Well, I see breakthroughs when they happen, I hope, but I'm not one who puts big emphasis on predicting them because, one, I've been wrong so often, and secondly, things can happen quite unexpectedly. I can talk to you about batteries, but that also brings us to the issue about critical materials. You're not using oil and gas, that means you're using metals a lot more. And you then have to ask, well, what is the United States strategy other than writing reports?
That's what we do in think tanks. But,
excuse me?
Not
certainly you do it more elegantly than you used to do it. But you have to ask yourself, what are you going to do about rare earth metals? What are you going to do about nickel, about cobalt, about all the lithium? All these can be managed, but there are very different arrangements. And mining has not been for many decades a strong point of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years ago, Congress did away with the Bureau of Mines. Split it up all over, Department of Energy, Department of Interior. I mean, there's no focus for critical minerals in this country.
Well, critical minerals used to always be thought of as being coal.
Yeah. That's okay.
But I do believe that there's more progress both in the private sector and in the government on critical materials than people. I mean, that it deserves it, but it is a big issue.
The big issue with critical minerals has, of course, been processing. I mean, at the time that EPA was coming in and wanting higher standards for the environment, was plants were wearing out and China was opening up, and we let them poison their environment rather than really invest here. Are we really ready to change that?
Yes, I think there are examples. There are a couple of examples. There are a couple of processing facilities in Nevada, I think, going up. And in fact, I think it's somebody, you could say something, I'm going to say this. I think that more than maybe even a half of our national security critical materials needs for manufacturing high-performance aircraft, things like that, probably will be available in the United States, from United States sources, not too distant future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a consciousness of it, but I don't really see an integrated strategy for it, in the country.
Or the execution of a program.
An execution. Even there are some very good examples. This lithium facility or plant in Nevada that's getting started, for example.
And again, which committee does it go to?
Yeah, well, it'll go to several. This is the problem.
Several.
There'll be several committees, and then transportation, interstate things that have to get worked out, and tailings. You get it's an EPA issue. It's an interior issue. It's we were really fractured, but I don't know how we solve that.
What have you been doing down here?
We are very good at admiring the problem down here. Let me ask about innovation policy, John. And you point out that number 6 in your list was about innovation in our country. Do you think we have an innovation strategy?
I most certainly do. The most recent one being the IRA. There you saw a complete shift in congressional attitudes towards innovation, where historically Congress has always said we only give money to fundamental research, or we give money to national purposes like space and defense. We don't give money to industry, because when industry gets that money, we don't know how to, your Department of Energy doesn't know how to choose it. And that's really, as Ronald Reagan would say, a market responsibility. But this year, or last year, 2022, time goes fast, they voted $350 billion. And as I understand it, this is appropriations, or, right?
Are you talking about the CHIPS
IRA,
Act or
the
IRA?
IRA. CHIPS Act is different, but IRA, $350 billion. And that was all going to be spent in a variety of different purposes, from hydrogen all the way to steel manufacturing, on downstream innovations, part of the process heading more and more towards deployment and entering markets than Congress has ever done before. It was is it true that it was a bipartisan bill?
Well, barely. I think it was one.
But of course, part of it was that there also was this incredible anti-China underpinning of it all. We have to be more, not only have to be more competitive with respect to our friends, we have to be aggressively competitive with respect to China. But it shows a willingness for Congress to say, we want to get more involved in innovation, downstream innovation. And that, I do believe, is a fundamental revolution, not anywhere true in our past.
Well, those were very important, and I thought the CHIPS Act was very important. Although they didn't fund all of the innovation part of it, they just funded the semiconductors, the manufacturing side of it. But we've got other things where we're not really that supportive. I mean, we've got the administration is trying to, memorialize march-in rights by Dole, where it undermines the ability for a university to sell its ideas and have a license without it being under threat. The administration did not defend, the property rights of the vaccine manufacturers. They let Germany do it, but they were very passive on it. I'm not sure that we have consistent innovation strategy.
First of all, you speak about Bayh-Dole, that's old think, so to speak. That's how do you encourage early stage innovation, first ideas. And it's a longer discussion and not one which
Yeah, I know. You and I have
which
argued
is-
about it a bit.
Huh?
We've argued a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm not as keen on it, Bayh-Dole, as many people are. But generally speaking, that part of the innovation spectrum, the early stage, I think has been done very well by this country. And you see it a little bit by every international student who comes walking here and wants to learn how to do it.
Right.
But downstream, it's completely different now. And you do need a strategy for that if you're going to do something like climate change and redo your entire energy economy. And in my mind, although there may be complicated reasons for it, the IRA Act is a signal that we have changed our philosophy. Congress has changed its philosophy. And so I think that that's an important step, and I hope it continues in a balanced way.
I think so. I hope so too. John, let me ask you, after you go through these 7 things that are big issues in the U.S., you talk about 4 international issues. The first one is about schedule, and I'll just quote, an agreement on a schedule for funding method for managing Global Green Climate Fund. And it's, at one of the COP conferences, we pledged $100 billion
A year.
a year. We're not getting there. And I think the energy transition to get to that carbon, or to the net zero in 2050 requires $1 trillion a year. So I understand this is a big issue. What do we do? Because I don't know if there's a lot of support for this at this stage.
Well, realism isn't going to help here. I mean, but I must tell you that I can't treat you as being a serious leader in the country if you say, climate is an existential threat. Climate is an international issue. It's not a local issue. It can't be solved just by OECD countries. The countries of the South and Africa in the South are going to really need a lot of help, and we have to be ready to basically transfer wealth. And if the answer is, well, we're not really willing to do that, now there are 2 ways we cheat. One way is we say, well, how do we score the $1 billion or the $100 billion? We score that by counting not only checks, but we also score that by if General Electric builds a plant down there to answer phone calls, and they will consider the construction of part of that as being a contribution to climate change. Well, that's just plain kidding yourself. It's just not going to happen. And then there's another more fundamental, deeply argued case. Who is responsible for the management and the planning of those transferred funds? Now, I can show you some really eloquent, sharp Indian deals. We want that money so we can build the kind of technology capacity that the United States has. We just don't want to do it to reduce carbon. We have a development, and the United States in their hands says, we'll only give you the money if you take it from our companies who are doing the work. And that issue complicates, in addition to the fact that it's a lot of dough. We're nowhere in that.
We're nowhere. I know it, but a lot of it is, these are government commitments. Is this this doesn't seem to be possible to do through government development grants.
I think it's quite an effort to get companies to recognize that this has to happen. And the question is, how complicated is how flexible is their thinking on this? I mean, I don't think that there's any question that the big oil companies understand that they're going to have to, if they're going to survive, they're going to have to find a way to provide energy in a new way, and that they'll be still able to increase their capabilities and their engineering skills in doing that. So,
I looked recently at a World Bank analysis of financing costs for renewable energy. And it was looking at the risk premium that is required to finance a project in Nigeria versus Minnesota, and up in developed countries, the risk premium is maybe 4 or 5% over the inflation rate. In Nigeria, it's 22% over inflation rate. We've got this vast difference in financing costs in third world countries. Are we going to have to deal with that really as the starting threshold if we're going to put this in the private sector?
Well, I wouldn't speak about it in terms of a risk premium. You're saying that is the private sector going to have to deal with the difference in capacity to execute engineering jobs, engineering projects of scale? And the answer is they've shown their ability to do that in the oil and gas world. And I don't think that I wouldn't rule out the fact that there's still, of course, an issue about whether people are wasting money, stealing money.
But if we need to get a massive build out of electricity, both generation and distribution in Africa, how do we deal with this risk premium differential for financing?
I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis here, but I want to say to you that the biggest problem in doing electricity in Africa is how do you get people to pay for the electricity they use?
I was going to say, that's true.
It's really more of a retail problem. I guess there are many examples now the World Bank has done where they try and show different ways of arranging being able to get payment for some of that stuff. But it's a challenge. But here you're doing what I hope this book will, that you're doing maybe better than the book, and that is how do we think about these problems in a realistic way and not kid ourselves? I gave a talk on this book at I rarely do this at Harvard, and there was a lot of talk about the unwillingness for people to say, the way things are now, we are not going to achieve these net zero targets. Let's start from there and ask, what do we have to do? People want to say, oh, it'll be all right. There's a wonderful article by a very talented person in this month's foreign policy. This is a woman who's, now I'm going to, she's the dean of the Tufts School of Foreign, and she says, don't worry about this, it's going to be all right. It's a very, very opposite of what I've been taught, how I sound. And I don't like to be negative. I don't like to be a pessimist. And she really gives a really nice presentation about why one should be forthcoming here and positive. So I want to clearly say here, I'm deficient in being a realist and a pessimist, a half-full guy. And this is a really nice article. I don't think she's right. I don't believe she's right. But I'm glad to hear that voice.
We do have to start with a premise that this is within human imagination to solve. If we just start with the idea that this is hopeless, it'll be hopeless.
Well, I don't think it is hopeless. But I do think it's hopeless in the way we're going about it.
Yeah, it is hopeless the way we're heading right now. John, in your second, you'd have a second topic in the international world, which is responding to unanticipated climate catastrophe. And you make a distinction here between mitigation and adaptation. Would you just take a minute to explain the difference for our audience and then how you think about what we do here, where we should put emphasis?
Well, first of all, I should say to you that every past report of the chairman of these conference of the parties has said there are two things we have to do. Number one, we have to sharply reduce our emissions. That's what everybody focuses on. And the other one is do more about adaptation. What does adaptation mean? Adaptation means is to take a preventive action, not an action which is proportional to the amount of emissions which are going to be reduced. Now, people, communities and individuals and families will adapt to climate change. But it can either be a sad and expensive experience, or it could be an easier experience. So I think the point is that we really know that adaptation is important, putting in place Example, Miami. I'm going to give you a piece of advice, or your grandchildren a piece of advice. Do not buy real estate in Miami. Bethesda's different.
Without scuba gear.
I mean, so, we know what'll happen. It's already happened in New York to an extent. They see the possibilities of increasing water, and so they say we have to build the dikes. And of course, we're not going to build the dikes by taxing people in Miami. We're going to do it by taxing all Americans and having it be a federal deal. And at the same time, our Congress will also vote insurance assistance for people who are in those places.
That's what I was going to come to here. You say in your book, you say that while there's been a considerable effort at adaptation, progress is constrained by lack of a market mechanism to aggregate individual payments into collective protection.
That's right.
And that sounds like insurance. Is there a way that we could
No.
use an insurance model?
We could certainly use it. We should use an insurance model, but you don't say if you go to more dangerous places, you should get paid more. That's not part of a good insurance policy.
No. Yeah, but it seems to me that if we're going to have to spend more on adaptation, we're going to have to look at a structural model change. I don't know if there are incentives that we should put in place.
You're completely right about that, and maybe it was sounds like it was a badly phrased piece of it.
No, I don't think it's badly framed. It caused me to think about it. Yeah.
You know, but my point is, adaptation. What government agency do you go to?
No.
I mean, has DOE ever thought about adaptation? I know. We go to the Department of Interior. I mean, so adaptation has no market structure or support, and it's a very serious issue. It's going to matter. And we're making no intellectual progress on this, much less.
Yeah. The last one of your international was dealing with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you say it's structurally wrong. What would you do?
What would I do? Well, I'm against NATO expansion, if that's the question you're asking. But the fact of the matter is, there are 196 members. They all have an equal voice. That clearly is unworkable. They all have very different economic and regional interests. So I would say, let's cut it down to 20. Now, I don't know whether it's in the book or not. I don't think it is. But my favorite idea is to turn the globe into a set of 5 or 6 regions. Does it say that in the book, you know? And have each one of these regions responsible for climate change in that region. Then, of course, dealing with the issue of border adjustments. But, for example, you could say the United States is going to be responsible for all of the Western Hemisphere. Not worrying about other things, but it's going to worry about the issue about transferring wealth support, managing the arrangements. So I would say if you did it regionally, that would be a better starting point. That's not obvious exactly how you would do it regionally, but I think that's a better starting point.
Let me. We're running out of time, and I want to get to one issue that I was surprised by, because in the first 10 chapters, I think every 4th page had something about nuclear, and yet there was nothing on nuclear in your addressing today's problems. Why? Why is nuclear not in your thinking at this stage?
Well, first of all, it's because I think about it so much and I talk about it so much that I just neglected to repeat all these arguments here. But I will say to you, who was it who told me the other day, who said, it's unimaginable to have a climate solution without nuclear power. Somebody reputable said that to me. And I agree with that. On the other hand, I've seen fumbling on nuclear all the way back to 2006. Is that the time when Scowcroft and our friend from Indiana did this report on what should be done about nuclear to give a complete framework? absolutely sound, which would help to have gotten those industry going again. Congress didn't pass it. Now, if Congress doesn't pass a well-thought-out plan, this is not a controversial plan with industry and environment. It was kind of really well done in terms of. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is people then say, think of tricks like small modular reactors. If we only make them smaller, we can have them come out like, a whole series of pancakes. Be much cheaper, but there's not a shred of evidence for that. If you look at the leading efforts on modular reactors, they all show very high costs. So you can't get over the overnight cost.
The construction costs are low, but the reactor costs are high. I know a little bit about the natrium reactor that we're putting out in Wyoming, and we don't have huge containment vessels and things of that nature. But this, when you say small modular reactor, this is bigger than a Greyhound bus. I mean, this is not small.
First of all, let me just tell you that the reactor that you like there, the natrium part of it is the very intelligently done storage for heat, so that they can balance everything better. But it uses liquid sodium coolant. I'm sure you've read the book. We almost lost Detroit from a liquid nuclear breeder reactor. So there are problems there which are still not completely settled.
Right.
But put writ large, the inability of the United States to encourage in a disciplined way, regulation the whole bit, waste. A nuclear base is a very, very very significant deficiency in.
It's over the last 8 years there have been 30 nuclear reactor plants that have been started or are committed to start. Only 4 of them have been American or Western. The rest are Chinese or Russian. Now, neither China or Russia are great champions of non-proliferation.
I think Russia has been very careful about proliferation.
Well, they've been careful.
They've never done some of this, but those 30 reactors.
These are big reactors.
Yeah. I don't know how much time you want to spend on this, but I do think that if you look right now, there are 4 or 5 what I would call medium-sized 300 megawatt reactors, boiling water reactors, which I think do have a chance. But as yet, until somebody shows that they can design and build and operate for a reasonable amount of money per kilowatt hour, this is going nowhere. And that's really been the.
Yeah, no, there's a real issue about affordability.
And I don't know what the government's role is here. It's not a CHIPS role.
Well, I mean,
I'm sorry.
The Department of Energy has been subsidizing development concepts for reactors, but nobody's addressing the inertia of demand. I mean, how do you address demand? I mean, you've got to overcome the risk of production, the risk of design.
Well, my colleague and friend Ernie Moniz and I have a structure for how you might do this in a more, I would say, more than one-of-a-kind way. That is not a government grant to one place, and not only government money, but a way of sort of try to share risk in doing a whole bunch of them in a different way. So there are people who are thinking about this, but you have to have an example of something built on the ground at reasonable cost.
Well, it's. I hope that you write a new book about that, because I think we need some good, solid thinking about nuclear going forward. There's really a lack of critical analysis at a quality level in town about it. It tends to be very aspirational or very theoretical, but nothing matching up.
I don't want to advertise too much, but when Moniz was secretary, I was chair of the advisory committee, and we did a big report on the future of nuclear. That is, the phrase to his request was, what needs to happen so that 5 years from now, or 7 years from now, whatever it was, we have 5 or 10 reactors under construction in the United States. So there's been some thinking about it. And it was a unanimous report with a lot of different.
Yeah, things, everything down at Vogel reinforced what's wrong with nuclear, we got off on the wrong foot on some. Anyway, this is a fascinating book, colleagues. This is the history is fascinating by itself, because you take us through times that we lived through, but you put it into clarity that was really quite good. And the back end is provocative reading. And so we've come to the hour a little bit, but I want to say thank you, John. It's been a lot of fun reading your book, and it's a lot of fun talking with you.
Well, thank you for having me here. And as I say, thank you for all you've accomplished.
Oh, my heavens.
And I look forward to your book as well.
Would everybody here say thank you to John Deutch on this remarkable book?